Hello and welcome back, and that is right, it is Data News of the Week, the video where we take all the little stories that have blibbed and blobbed around the internet that involve data and squeeze them into a single video. Before we go any further, anyone may have noticed last week that the video, I do put out a news video every single week, may have noticed this on my channel. My video was removed, and quickly, for those that have contacted me about it, from what I understand, looking at the appeals process and when I went through it with YouTube, it looks like my story that involved people, nefarious groups utilising ransomware to attack Russian targets in order to extract that, was deemed against community guidelines. Again, I pretty much disagree. I went all the way through the appeals process, but it was shut down. But if you are still heading to that old link that was shared online and you are seeing this screen, that is the reason why. I might drop it on like a shared drive or something so people can watch it if they choose. I'm going to see how that goes. But let's continue with this week's news, which is first and foremost a vulnerability again. This is one that's happening in the background of OPENSSL, and it is an exploit that was volunteered by Google analysts and security analysts halfway through March, and it has since been patched on the OPENSSL most current recent revision and some other ones as well. But unfortunately, this is something that applies to NAS brands, and of course, the two we're going to talk about are SYNOLOGY and QNAP. They are on their own respective advisory panels there. They have raised this on their respective panels, and both of them are currently in the process of trying to resolve this situation, with both of them still on the investigation stage with all of their individual operating systems and the versions of DSM and QTS respectively. And now, what is this? For those that aren't aware, this is a system that can be a vulnerability that can be utilized via overworking the system with certification of an SSL certificate, and it can ultimately lead to a DOS, a denial of service attack, and effectively shutting a system down. Now, the circumstances needed to do this are actually quite refined. Fair play to SYNOLOGY, they go into a little bit more detail about the vulnerability with regards to their platform, and on the QNAP side they talk a little bit about it, but you'll probably find out more by heading straight over to the NIST and finding out more about it there and how this works and how artificial certificates can be utilized to create a loop, overworking the system and making it fall over. And also the eventual benefits of this are negligible. Aside from being able to remote kill a server, I'm not 100% certain this can be utilized to kill certification processes and therefore allow a kind of around the edge way of getting into a system. But still, nonetheless, both of those top tier NAS brands are currently working on resolutions for this, and as you can see, in some cases, they've listed all of it, and even on the SYNOLOGY platform, if you've read about this story online, it seems a lot more news stories are floating around about the QNAP side than the SYNOLOGY side. So I wasn't aware if SYNOLOGY users knew that they were also kind of in the boat in this, to a lesser degree, I would argue, perhaps, given their architecture, but still, nonetheless, this is another time just to keep an eye on things internally, and particularly those of you that take advantage of OPENSSL in your certification. And again, this has been resolved on the OPENSSL side. This is just a question of QNAP and SYNOLOGY implementing it into their later firmware updates on their side. Next up, a quick, and I would argue quite interesting story, but I appreciate that it's pretty niche. An Easter egg has been found in Windows version 1 after 37 years. Now, let's face it, you're looking at this video, you can see that I utilize Windows in my architecture, and Easter eggs are hardly a rare thing in these in OSs, but not just Windows there. But the idea that not only was an Easter egg found after 37 years by people that still like to play with the old systems, when after firmware updates are out of the window and they can really get into those systems, but moreover, what's interesting is about the nature of this Easter egg, because although you can find out a lot of information about who developed a lot of the software and some of the attributes and some of the add-on services there isn't really a kind of closing credits window where you can read everyone. And this particular Easter egg allows you to see a breakdown of people who were involved in it. And if you go a little bit deeper into it, you can see that not only is this the Windows team themselves volunteering their names, but quite interesting, one of those names is Gabe Newell. That's right, Half-Life, Portal, Steam, all of that. Gabe Newell, it's on there, and this was discovered by Lucas Brooks. You can head over to his Twitter page there, and he's got a whole video showing a lot of this process and how it's done. And of course, the overall result of that and finding that information there. What's also quite interesting about this is further investigation showed that he managed to find it in Windows version 2 as well there. And it's quite interesting to see if not only that these managed to get out there and indeed Windows 3 as well, but also is there anything else that we've kind of forgotten about after more than 30 years of Windows in our offices and our homes? And moving back over to the subject of SSDs, let's talk about PCIe Gen 5 again. Phison published a report recently breaking down a lot of the latest updates on this particular protocol for, SSD technology that has quite a lot of bandwidth to play with, and addressed one big factor that a lot of people have had, and that is to do with heat. Now, this is something we've talked about on the channel before. Indeed, we've talked about PCIe Gen 5 several times in the news videos as this kind of new architecture starts to be rolled out commercially, probably towards autumn winter of 2022 in its earliest phases. And the subject of heat dissipation and the amount of heat that's going to be generated by these microcontrollers has been addressed now in a great deal of detail, effectively saying that there is no way you should utilize PCIe Gen 5 without heat dissipation or indeed active heating methods. Now, heat dissipation of SSDs and worrying about whether you need a heatsink or not is something I've talked about a lot here on the channel, not just with PS5 content generally, but in terms of SSDs in the PCIe Gen 4 architecture as well. And the very idea that you would spend hundreds and indeed in some cases you'll see later on thousands of pounds on these SSDs without taking into account heat and its impact on performance and durability is mind-blowing to me. And as I say, do check out my video where I showed the performance benefits over time of utilizing a heatsink versus without a heatsink here. Now, when it comes to that report from Phison that's been published online, one of the things they do highlight not only is the performance benefits or indeed the performance sustainability with a heatsink there, but also the added benefits at PCIe Gen 5 for active heat sinks. Now, what that means is, unlike a lot of the heat sinks I've talked about on the channel up till now, these are passive heat sinks. Lumps of aluminium, metal, copper, whatever, that is applied to an SSD with a little bit of thermal paste or padding or something in the middle to help dissipate that heat. But the amount of heat being generated at the PCIe Gen 5 level sounds like it's dissipation of a passive level is not going to be enough, and they've recommended taking advantage of active M2 cooling. That is cooling that not only takes advantage of aluminium and copper, but also takes advantage of active airflow. The one you're seeing here on screen, or the one more precisely I'm holding in my hand, this is an Icebox M2 active heating code. We'll be doing a video on the PCIe Gen 4 to give you some idea about the difference and the benefits of whether you should take advantage of an active cooling fan. But look at the price tag there. That's 42 nicker on Amazon for that. Now, there are cheaper ones out there, such as the Growl Gear. That one's knocking around for 26, and that utilizes a smaller fan. Let's bring that image up a little bigger. It takes advantage of a little fan, but takes advantage of a two-stage aluminium and copper based pass-through there. And you can go even lower, down to £20 here, or for the Eno one there that's got a tiny fan built in. But again, that is when, if you're going to have a cooling fan on there and you're already going to be utilizing power connector, this heatsink here I would only really look at if you're looking at compact installations, and in particularly if there's a PS5 Pro that takes advantage of Gen 5 connectivity, which isn't impossible, there's not going to be the means to add a power connector on a console. I just can't see it. They would never do that in their closed architecture. So if you're a PC user looking at something like this, I would immediately spring a little bit extra and go for one with a bigger fan anyway. But this is still something we're going to talk about more and more as time wears on, because the Gen 5 tier and the fact that it's almost certainly going to require active cooling is going to be something that is going to be a bit of a shock to a lot of hardware client manufacturers are already having a hard enough time factoring in space and airflow for passive heatsinks to start with. Finally, let's talk about some new products, and we're going to return to the subject of an SSD that I talked about here on the channel already, and that is the SABRENT 8TB Rocket 4 Plus. Now, I've talked about this a couple of times in the news videos, I think in the last 7 or 8 months. Firstly, because SABRENT are the first company in the world, from what I can see from my research, to have produced not only an 8TB PCIe Gen 4 SSD at 2280, they're not the first to do that, but they are the first to do it using 3D TLC memory and taking advantage of that Phison E18 controller. This is the first real kind of reliable versus durability and performance. PCIe Gen 4 SSD to hit 8 TB and not have to resort to the longer SSDs at 22110 in length. Now, we talked about it. We talked a little bit about the review that we saw where they did some benchmark and speed testing as well, which is always good to see online, and I believe that was a few months ago, but again, it wasn't commercially available, and now we've got a good understanding of the pricing, and on Amazon right now this is knocking around for 1,500 nicker. So of course that's dollars, and that's a huge sum of money, but again, you've got to factor that in to that capacity there. If you look at the 4 TB model, for example, that one's knocking at $700. So once you really break it down, you can start to see how these things are provisioned out, particularly because a lot of the components being utilized have to work that bit harder and have to be that bit more durable. And although, yes, it's an enormous sum of money, users that have only got one bay and are going to look at particularly multi-bay deployment are probably going to be interested in this. But do remember, if you're a PS5 user, this apparently is not compatible with PS5 systems due to it having a 4 TB limit to start with. So don't go look, and not that you really should at that price tag, but still nonetheless. Carrying on with the subject of new releases, we can talk about what LOCKERSTOR did recently, which was, you know, pretty impressive for the brand. Now, this involves the LOCKERSTOR series, the LOCKERSTOR 2, 4, and now 6. Now, these 3 systems originally released, I believe, towards the end of 2020. Now we're in 2022, where a lot of brands tend to refresh a lot of their series. What they've done is double down on the systems they've got there and produced Gen 2 versions. Now, in the past, whenever you see Gen 2 or the number 2 on the end of a system model number, it tends to make people think, it's going to be a side grade, not an upgrade. But in the case of what we're seeing here, these upgrades on the LOCKERSTOR system are genuinely impressive. The architecture inside and outside has been overhauled in a number of incredibly interesting ways. For example, what we're seeing here, if we dip into the specifications of that 2-bay there, we can talk about some of the internal improvements there. So first and foremost, they're taking advantage of that new N5105 processor, and with its higher clock speed, and thanks to it having more PCI lanes and an improved chipset, meaning that now we can take advantage of more memory, and that memory inside, I should add, is an improved 2933 megahertz memory as well, something that no one else is running right now. Now, alongside those other internal improvements, the 2, the 4, and the 6-bay, remember the 2-bay as well, most importantly, now all arrive with 4 M2 SSD slots there, with each of those slots being PCIe Gen 3. So again, that is a huge amount of potential performance, and having that in the 2-bay is particularly impressive overall for me. Now, continuing with those improvements, it still has 2.5 GBE like its predecessor, but it has ramped up other external ports there on the rear, such as taking advantage of USB USB 3.2 Gen 2. So that means those ports can now provide 1,000 megabytes per second to an external connected drive. On top of that, it also arrived with HDMI 2.0B. And although the LOCKERSTOR Portal application HDMI isn't quite as slick as some of the other ones out there, it's still pretty good. And the fact that now you're going to get even better fidelity and frame rates out of the HDMI out here is genuinely impressive. Now, the fact they've gone the Gen 2 route is something I'm surprised by, because I think there's enough differences here on this system compared with its predecessor in the non-Gen 2 version that I think it would volunteer to not need to be a Gen 2. I think this could be a stand-up release on its own. But everything from the improvements in the internal to the external on these systems, for me, make these Gen 2 a serious hardware contender in 2022. And I'm really looking forward to talking about this. I might even make this into a dedicated video outside the news. But I just wanted to put this out here now rather than I talk about it in a couple of weeks in its own dedicated video. But this has been Data News of the Week. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, chuck me a like and click subscribe to be well informed of news every single week here on the channel. Take advantage of the free advice section, and otherwise have yourself a bloody nice weekend. See you later.